Hello, my name is Anthony Tran, and welcome back to the Unknown Military History Podcast. We left off the previous episode with the Macedonian regent Perdiccas, the man who bore the ring of Alexander, and a possible claimant to the throne, dead. In the aftermath of his death, Antigonus the One-Eyed would come to rule over his eastern provinces. Though a peace seemed to merit the new order, this was surely not the case, as Antigonus's enemy, Eumenes of Cardia, was still at large with a massive force inside Antigonid territory. We shall now place ourselves in 318 BC, as tensions will once more boil over into a new bloody crisis, and new characters take up the sword. The First War of the Diadochi can be summarized as a war against the regent Perdiccas and his supporters such as Eumenes of Cardia. Its main events took place in the Asian continent and in Egypt, where the regent met his doom. However, to understand the crisis that would plague the fractured empire ahead, we will now return to mainland Greece under the local regent Antipater. After the year 318 BC, Antipater consolidated his position as not only the local regent of Macedon, but as the supreme regent over the whole empire. Antipater had the support of the capable general and now strategos Antigonus, as well as Lysimachus of Thrace and Ptolemy of Egypt. With the new position of regent, Antipater now had the responsibility of being the guardian of the late Alexander's wife Roxanne and his young son Alexander IV, as well as Philip III, Alexander's disabled brother. However, by 319 BC, Antipater was old, 81 years old. Succumbing to old age, Antipater died with his son Cassander by his side. Now Cassander was another one of the individuals who was educated and lived amongst Alexander himself, alongside that of his closest comrades. Yet despite this, Cassander was often at odds with Alexander during his campaigns, in particular disagreeing with Alexander about his recruitment of Asians into the Macedonian army and his practice of adopting Persian culture and wives. A later contemporary who was critical of Cassander and his future dynasty even suggested that Cassander may have poisoned Alexander, though there is no evidence to prove this. Whatever the case may be, Antipater would not choose Cassander to succeed him. Instead, Antipater chose Polyperchon as the new regent. Polyperchon was an experienced officer and second in command to Antipater, who was notable for routing the Thessalian cavalry of Menon during the Lamian War, which is deemed an invincible force. Antipater's son Cassander, however, did not take kindly upon this decision, and we shall see those events play out soon enough. We will now turn to the theater of Asia, where Antigonus was crushing rebellions. Going back to 318 BC, Antigonus faced a rebellion from the governor of Phrygia, Arrhidaeus. This was the same man who had been commissioned to protect Alexander's body, but lost it to Ptolemy. Meanwhile, he faced another uprising from the governor of Lydia, Cleitus the White, a general who played a role in crushing the Greek rebellion in the Lamian War. Splitting up his army, Antigonus marched against the forces of Arrhidaeus, defeating him and then regrouping his forces to face Cleitus. However, by that point, Cleitus had fled to mainland Greece to seek aid from the regent Polyperchon. Meanwhile, Antigonus also received a distinguished guest of his own. Cassander, desiring the throne of Macedon, left Greece and arrived at Antigonus's court, seeking his aid in overthrowing Polyperchon. From there, Cassander would request troops from Antigonus as well as a fleet in order to retake Macedon for himself. Antigonus, now seen as an enemy by Polyperchon, who had allied himself with Cleitus, decided to take the side of Cassander and provide him with the needed equipment in order to conquer Greece. Cassander thus sailed with his forces to Athens, where Polyperchon was attempting to take the city. Cassander's abrupt arrival forced Polyperchon to withdraw, and he instead marched on the city of Megapolis, which had allied with Cassander. Damis, The oligarch who ruled over the city of Megapolis did not recognize Polyperchon as the regent and was prepared to defend against him. When Polyperchon and his 24,000 men made camp at the gates of the city, they set up wooden towers to scale the walls, while engineers dug tunnels under the walls in order to collapse them. This plan initially worked, as 3 towers and a part of the wall came down, and Polyperchon ordered his men to breach the gaps in the city. However, the militia gave a stubborn resistance, and Polyperchon's men suffered heavy losses from their attempts to breach the defenses. Eventually, Polyperchon ordered his men back into the camp. This wasn't over though, as during the night, the oligarch Damis ordered hit-and-run attacks as well as archers to attack Polyperchon, keeping his troops restless. Desperate for a breakthrough, Polyperchon sent his war elephants against the defenders. However, Damis had intel on Polyperchon's elephants because before the day began, he had ordered his men to set up iron spikes, hooks, and nails to be added to the defenses to counter the elephants. Thus, as Polyperchon ordered his beasts of war to charge, they were met with resistance not only from the traps, but from bows and catapults as well. This caused the elephants to panic and stampede back to Polyperchon's line, causing more casualties. Polyperchon thus ended the siege and marched off. Polyperchon's defeat at the siege of Megapolis caused many of the Greek cities to side with Cassander, forcing him to flee to Epirus, a neighboring, independent Greek kingdom in modern-day Albania. With him was Alexander IV and Roxanne. Meanwhile, Antigonus had gathered a large fleet to face off against Cleitus the White. He placed his 130 ships under the command of Nicanor to face Cleitus in the Hellespont near Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul, while he marched with an army to join. The initial battle of Byzantium was a disaster for Antigonus, as Cleitus destroyed nearly 70 of his ships. Nicanor and the fleet were forced to make land and join up with Antigonus. Using his remaining 60 ships, Antigonus took command and even hired levies from the city-state of Byzantium to attack Cleitus by land. When dawn broke the next day, Cleitus's victorious forces found themselves surrounded by Antigonus by land and sea. Cleitus and his forces fought back bravely, but they were cut down to a single man, with Cleitus the White falling in battle. In mainland Greece, Polyperchon found an ally of Alexander the Great's, now elderly mother Olympias of Epirus. Olympias had been the 4th wife of Philip II and was very influential in the process of securing the throne for Alexander when he was young. Now recognizing that Cassander's invasion of Greece would spell the end for her progeny, she sided with Polyperchon. Her first act was to execute a captured Philip Arrhidaeus, the disabled half-brother of Alexander who had a claim to the throne and defected to Cassander. Yet Polyperchon and Olympias' joint invasion of Macedon would be a failure, as Cassander, now with Antigonus and the majority of support amongst the Greeks, managed to conquer the mainland and capture Olympias herself. Polyperchon's authority was now reduced to almost nothing, and he was forced to flee to the Peloponnesus in southern Greece, where he held several strongholds such as Corinth. Cassander, who now had authority over Olympias, Roxanne, and Alexander IV, decided to kill Olympias. However, his troops refused to cooperate with this, due to the fact that Olympias was the mother of Alexander the Great and the wife of Philip II, whose memories they respected. Recognizing this fact, Cassander instead ordered members of Olympias' family to kill her, to take revenge for their own loved ones' deaths. Thus, the mother of Alexander, who had led them to the borders of the known world, was unceremoniously stoned that day by victims of her own power struggles. Yet, she showed great dignity, refusing to bend and even fixing her hair as she died. Cassander, however, refused to give Olympias a proper burial. Thus, Cassander's authority over mainland Greece was now solidified against his father Antipater's wishes. The only regions of Greece which stood independent from Cassander now included the Peloponnesus strongholds held by now weak Polyperchon and the kingdom of Epirus to the west. With the defeat of Polyperchon and his allies in the west, Antigonus now looked to end the last remaining threat to the new order once and for all. The capable Eumenes, the sole surviving enemy of the Perdiccas royalist faction, was on the loose throughout Antigonus's Asian holdings. Eumenes had recruited a large number of mercenaries, as well as the Silver Shields and Hypaspis, who were loyal to the royal family and did not stand with Cassander's murder of Olympias. While Antigonus had been fighting Clitus the White at Byzantium, Eumenes had marched to the eastern provinces of Antigonus's domain, securing the loyalty of those satraps there, which nearly doubled his army. Antigonus marched at the head of a large army to face Eumenes and his host. The two forces met at a plain in Perdiccas in the province of Media. This was to be one of the great battles of the war. Antigonus had around 34,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry along with 65 war elephants. Eumenes had 35,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 125 war elephants. The two generals drew up their forces in a defensive position at the start of the battle, and for about the next week they stood off against each other, neither army making a move. However, by the end of this period of time, Antigonus was running out of supplies, and decided to march to the region of Gabiene to get them. However, deserters from Antigonus's army alerted Eumenes to this, and Eumenes took the initiative and marched to Gabiene first. Antigonus was forced to give chase to Eumenes and managed to halt his army before he reached the region. Antigonus deployed his light horsemen under the command of his subordinate Python, while his heavy cavalry and light infantry were placed on the right flank. He placed his main phalanx at the center. Commanding the heavy cavalry itself was none other than the son of Antigonus himself, Demetrius, who was about 20 years old. He would become a major character in future events, but today at Perdiccas he was facing his first battle. Meanwhile, Eumenes placed his elite silver shield phalanx in the center, alongside highly skilled Hypaspis on the right. In both the armies' reserves were war elephants and extra cavalry. The Battle of Perdiccas began when Python charged Eumenes' heavy cavalry with his more numerous light cavalry against Antigonus' command to hold position. Eumenes' forces held, and he was able to move elephants to the flank, as well as additional light cavalry, inflicting heavy casualties on Python's divisions. Python and his forces were routed and driven back to the foothills. Meanwhile, the two phalanxes engaged, yet Eumenes had the upper hand due to his elite silver shields. What is important to note is that these silver shield pikemen were 50 to 70 years old, men who were veterans of Alexander's Persian campaign. Antigonus' less experienced pikemen were broken under the impact of the silver shields and began to retreat. Yet despite this, Antigonus remained on the battlefield. The push of Eumenes' phalanx had opened up a gap between the center of Eumenes' forces and their left flank. Recognizing this opportunity, Antigonus ordered his son Demetrius and the heavy cavalry into this gap, managing to flank the center of Eumenes' line. The battle thus began to slow down. Eumenes' heavy units held their ground, however, denying Antigonus any advantage. Eventually, Eumenes decided to break from the battle and make camp at the behest of his exhausted troops. Antigonus remained on the battlefield, claiming victory. However, the truth was different, as Antigonus had lost 3,700 men, with 4,000 of his men wounded, while Eumenes only lost 540 men and 1,000 wounded. Therefore, the Battle of Perdiccas ended with a tactical victory for Eumenes, though it meant little, as Antigonus was able to leave the site of battle by night in order to regroup. The situation was not really any different than before. The next year, 315 BC, Antigonus returned to face Eumenes, attempting to ambush him in Persia. However, local villagers saw Antigonus' forces and alerted Eumenes. Eumenes was able to use this information and tricked Antigonus into believing that he had an entire army with him. Gathering his host, Eumenes created a large campsite on the hills. He had each soldier make a campfire to give off the impression that his force was twice as large as it really was. Antigonus gave up on his plan to ambush Eumenes. and he drew up his forces, camping outside opposite of Eumenes. The two armies drew up their equal forces at the field of Gabiene. Antigonus placed his mobile units on the right in order to strike against Eumenes' left, while the center consisted of pikemen and the left-wing horsemen. Once again, Demetrius held command of the heavy cavalry. Meanwhile, Eumenes placed himself and his heavy horse opposite Antigonus' mobile units. Eumenes' strategy, as before, was to use his silver shields to win in the center. Before the battle began, Antigonus, leader of the silver shields, wrote to parley with Antigonus' forces. Antigonus stated, "Wicked men, are you sinning against your fathers, who conquered the whole world under Philip and Alexander?" This speech lowered the morale of Antigonus' troops, while Eumenes and his forces became heartened. Eumenes thus advanced his forces. As Eumenes advanced his forces, however, a large cloud of dust was blown into the air, obscuring both armies' vision. As the skirmishers and elephants engaged, Antigonus sent some of his light cavalry to ride around Eumenes' left flank. These light cavalry were able to seize Eumenes' baggage train and carry them off. The baggage train included the money as well as the families of Eumenes' men. Meanwhile, Antigonus and Demetrius rode with their heavy cavalry through the clouds to hit Eumenes' flank, causing the enemy cavalry to rout. As Eumenes' forces were driven back, his elephants were also killed by Antigonus' skirmishers. However, in the center, the silver shields once again broke Antigonus' phalanx. Yet, recognizing that he was about to be outflanked, Eumenes ordered his army to withdraw from the battlefield, giving Antigonus the field victory. The aftermath of the Battle of Gabiene was similar to that of Perdiccas, inconclusive. Both forces still possessed a similar number of forces, despite Antigonus losing 5,000 men and Eumenes suffering a similar number of casualties. Later that night, as both armies were encamped, Eumenes attempted to persuade his troops to regroup and catch Antigonus by surprise the following morning. However, the eastern satraps and silver shields had grown discontent with Eumenes and his cause, which they saw as going nowhere. It was especially true with the silver shields, who lost much of their family and possessions when Antigonus raided the baggage train earlier in the battle. These traitorous men thus opened negotiations with Antigonus and struck a deal with him that they would serve Antigonus and hand over Eumenes if Antigonus gave them their baggage and families back. Antigonus agreed to the deal. Therefore, during the night, the silver shields seized Eumenes and his generals, bringing them over to Antigonus. Antigonus held a council to decide the fate of Eumenes and his generals. Though he recognized Eumenes' martial prowess and respected him as a fellow commander, he was persuaded by his officers to have Eumenes executed. Thus, Alexander's former secretary and one of the most capable of the Diadochi generals was now dead. Antigonus also executed Antigonus, leader of the Silver Shields. As for the rest of Eumenes' army, they were incorporated into Antigonus' forces. Yet Antigonus did not trust the Silver Shields, whom had betrayed their commander. He thus sent 1,000 of them away to the Indian border, where they would be used as expendable border units to fight against the mountain tribes. Thus, with the death of Eumenes and the victory of Antigonus and Cassander, a new order was now established. Cassander controlled most of mainland Greece, while Antigonus ruled over the Asian provinces. Ptolemy still controlled Egypt, while Lysimachus controlled Thrace, defending it against the northern barbarians. As for their enemies, they were all dead or reduced to almost nothing, like Polyperchon. Meanwhile, Alexander IV and his mother Roxanne remained political prisoners of Cassander. And with that ends what is known as the Second War of the Diadochi, a war which saw new faces rise and old faces fall. And I will see you next time on Unknown Military History. Thank you for listening.